Now I'm going to call upon Mark TURIN, who's from the University of British Columbia, First Nations and Endangered Language Program, and the Institute for Critical Language Studies, Native Indigenous Studies, Department of Anthropology. And it's going to be a very interesting experience because our moderator is physically here, all of his 3 dimensions in place, and the entire panel is going to be 2-dimensional, and it's going to be quite exciting to see how this works. So I'm going to turn everything over to Mark. Thank you, Mark, for coming.
Well, thank you, Ian. Thank you, Amos, Priska, and the many others for convening this important and timely colloquium. Taking stock of this ongoing perversity, we live in a country that has 2 official languages, neither of which are from here. What does it mean now in this operational space to be thinking about the promise of a bill, C91? Just a reflection on the sort of the double meaning of the title of our colloquium. Indigenous Languages Policy in the wake of Bill C91. Wake as in aftermath, or as in vigil for a dead body. As Derek so helpfully reminded us this morning, Indigenous languages wouldn't need the reclamation, the revitalization, the resurgence that we're talking of if they hadn't been devitalized to begin with. This is the 11th hour. Let's not forget that the full weight of the colonial regime has been and continues to be leveraged against Indigenous communities to break apart the link between language and land and identity and culture. As Roger said so powerfully just now, you created this problem, you paid for fixing it. Before I introduce our first speaker, I'd like to thank the interpreters to my left. The work of simultaneous or consecutive interpretation is heavy language work. I know, I've done it in the UN. As a senior interpreter once said to me, the problem with this work is you only smell it when it's bad. It's like air. Perfection is totally invisible. So thank you for your work. We're very fortunate today to be joined by 4 colleagues, all in disembodied digital form, 3 from BC, 1 from Alberta. And I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Suzanne Gessner, from the First Peoples Cultural Council, who will be speaking on Indigenous language legislation, the path ahead. Suzanne.
Okay, hello everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, Squechel, Suzanne Gessner, Tennisnet. I'm here today in Vancouver, traditional territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people, and very happy to be joining you for this colloquium. I'm sorry I can't be there in person, but we'll see how this works out with the Zoom. So I'm going to see if I can share my screen here with you. Okay, so can everyone see the slides?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, so I'm here representing First Peoples Cultural Council today, and my co-authors on the chapter we submitted are Tracy Herbert and Aliana Parker. And I do want to spend the first part of the talk kind of giving you an overview of First Peoples Cultural Council, maybe in a little more detail than I usually do. Just one, because I'm sure there are some of you there who don't know about us. And secondly, because we're one of the regional organizations that Roger was speaking of that's, I think, really necessary if we're going to support this work across the country. So just to give you a little better understanding of what a regional organization does. So we're a provincial Crown corporation in BC that supports the revitalization of both arts, language, and cultural heritage in British Columbia. And we were established in 1990 through legislation. So there is provincial legislation that established our governance. What we really want to see is BC's Indigenous languages, cultures, and arts thriving, and the cultural knowledge expressed through Indigenous languages, cultures, and arts being recognized and embraced. And we have several goals. First, to sustain and invest in the lasting vitality of Indigenous language, arts, and cultural heritage in BC through successful revitalization strategies. To support Indigenous communities and individuals to meet their arts, language, culture, and heritage revitalization goals. To build awareness and appreciation for Indigenous languages among everyone in BC and promote the work that we do to communities, funders, and leadership. And also to provide leadership on a provincial, national, and global scale to support Indigenous arts, language, culture, and heritage language or heritage revitalization. And that's why we became so involved in C91 was this sort of part of our mandate. Although we are a provincial Crown corporation, we are Indigenous led. So in particular, the board of directors has 10 Indigenous directors. There's 3 government seats. And we also have an advisory committee where there's a member representing each one of the 34 Indigenous languages here in BC. And there's other ways we take direction from the communities that we serve as well. As for the current state of things in BC, BC has rich linguistic diversity, as I'm sure you all know. We have more than half of all Indigenous languages in Canada are here in BC. So we have 34 First Nations languages. That's more than 90 dialects among those languages. And of course, Michif, the Métis language is spoken here, and we also have lots of languages from other parts of Canada that are spoken here now as well. But 34 were Indigenous to what is now BC. In terms of speakers, only 3% of First Nations people in BC consider themselves fluent in their mother tongue. We do survey our communities and produce a report every 4 years where we try to track the speakers, semi-fluent speakers, learners, school situations, all sorts of things having to do with language. So while the number of L1 speakers is declining, the good news in our last report is that both the number of learners, but especially exciting, the number of people under the age of 24 who are considered fluent, both those numbers are increasing. So there's lots of reason for hope. I don't think I need to explain to any of you why this work is important, but of course we know it's not just about language. Language connects to everything with identity, and it has so many more outcomes, more than just language. It has to do with health and wellness and even economic and educational outcomes as well. So now I want to talk a little bit about kind of the actual day-to-day work we do a little bit more to give you a sense of those sorts of things. And our work has really increased over the last couple of years because we received a $50 million investment over 3 years from the provincial government in March of 2018, which has substantially changed things. And you can really see that the difference of having financial support makes. So this more than doubled the language immersion opportunities and also expanded our First Voices, which I'll talk about. So last fiscal year then, we distributed $11.4 million in grants to our communities across the province. And not only more funding, it allowed us to offer more stability as well. So people can apply for multi-year grants because we have this 3-year window of funding, which we have never had before. So as of right now, we have 9 language grant streams, 9 arts and music grant streams, and 2 heritage grant streams, which the heritage section is quite new. So we're quite excited about being able to support heritage work as well. Focusing in on the language work we do, the kinds of grants that we offer and the activities we support. There's one for digitization, because we know there's a lot of material out there on old cassettes, even on old reel-to-reel tapes and things that certainly we don't want to lose. We're a third-party delivery agent for the Department of Canadian Heritage for the ALI. We have Language Nest, the immersion for preschoolers. We have a language revitalization planning program, and we're really focusing on increasing this area, particularly with the federal legislation coming down, where it will become increasingly important for communities to develop language plans in order to get funding. So with this program, for example, we've hired 4 full-time language coaches who are able to help communities one-on-one and also through just general workshops to help communities do that planning work. We also have Mentor Apprentice, it's been one of our most successful immersion programs. A more general open strategy program, the BC Language Initiative, where you can apply for a variety of things. And also a fairly new one is Reclaiming My Language, a course for silent speakers. And so this is to get people who understand but don't speak their language, starting to use it again. I'm going to run through these next slides really quickly, but just to give you an idea, we can always come back to them if there are questions. But we also do research, monitoring, as I talked about with the speakers in BC, documentation, technology. First Voices is our main online language archiving app. It's community run and driven, but communities can have an online space for their languages and other things there. And the knowledge sharing piece. So we're involved with the Endangered Languages Project website. We had a big conference this spring with over 1,000 people from 20 different countries brought together to celebrate Indigenous languages. So there's that kind of work that we do too, along with developing programs, tools, and resources, which really works towards the capacity building piece that Roger was talking about, the role for regional organizations to do that kind of work with communities. For the last bit, I want to focus on the bill and kind of, I mean, our paper talked a lot, was written, the framework was written, you know, of course, before the bill came out. So now that the bill is out and we know what it's looking like, we kind of just want to focus on a couple of pieces that we really think are important as we move forward in the implementation phase. So we were quite involved in the development of the Act in different ways. So for example, here in BC, we held 5 regional engagement sessions across the province to let people know that this legislation was being developed and to elicit their feedback on what they would like to see in that legislation. And so we produced a report on that, which we shared with the Canadian Heritage and also with the co-developing partner, AFN. We did some research on the costs of language revitalization, both sharing sort of our costing for our work, but also looking at some international pieces of legislation and kind of how, you know, what we can learn from what's being done globally. We presented to the Standing Committee and the Senate Committee reviewing the Act, and through this whole process, Tracy Herbert, our CEO, has been on the AFN's Technical Committee on Language and still sits on that committee through this implementation stage to provide advice. So as Roger mentioned, we have legislation now, which is really exciting and we are really happy about. But of course, I'll agree with him that it didn't necessarily cover everything that we were asking for. But the pieces that we really see as being important to ensure that we have going forward is a national Indigenous languages strategy. There was sort of no specific guideline in the legislation for actually having a strategy. I'll talk about why that's important. How the funding is to be delivered is still quite unclear. And again, I feel like I'm echoing a lot of what Roger said, but of course the funding that we saw for the next 4 years in budget 2019 doesn't come anywhere near to our costing estimates as to what we see as being necessary. So hopefully that message gets out there, and we will hope to see more funding in the future. So why do we need a national languages strategy, a really specific laid out strategy? Well, I mean, we really need to clearly state the goals and priorities, the actions needed to meet those. We need to make sure that we have a way to actually measure what we're doing. I know within our own organization, things kind of shifted about 15 years ago where, management kind of came to the realization of, we've been doing this work for a number of years, and are we making a difference? And it's like, well, we haven't really been measuring, how many speakers there are, or, sort of really specific targets and metrics. So that's when we started doing it. And that's certainly something that's going to be necessary at a national level as well, to make sure that we're making the most of these investments. And maybe the most important reason for having an instituted strategy comes from our international research from Indigenous language policies in 10 countries. And we found that where there was legislation that mandated a defined action plan or language strategy, it was actually a predictive factor that both positively and negatively correlated with high and low levels of government funding, respectively. So having that strategy is a way to really tie it to the funding and make sure you're getting funding for the work. So I don't think anyone's going to argue that a strategy is needed, but the question is, who is going to do this strategy? Is it the Office of the Commissioner? We don't really think that's the best place for this to happen. There's kind of a conflict of interest there. We do need an Office of the Commissioner, but their role is really more of a watchdog role. We'll be doing the 3- and 5-year assessments. So you don't really want someone developing the plan and at the same time assessing how well they're doing on the plan. Better to have those in kind of 2 different places. It's not really the best for the Department of Canadian Heritage to be doing this. We heard very strongly across the country that people want Indigenous control of Indigenous languages. It's not the role of political organizations. So we really think there is a missing piece, which is sort of yes to the regional organizations, but also yes to kind of a national organization with really specific roles related to the legislation, acknowledging concerns about not wanting too much bureaucracy. So it can provide broad management of the bill, keep it at arm's length from the government, the commissioner, and political organizations, like funding into the future, create a place to connect those regional organizations, because regional organizations will be supporting similar languages, so it would be good to have kind of an established way to connect everyone, and coordinate and collate the reporting that's going to happen for the bill. The main roles of that organization could be to develop the strategy, manage and distribute the annual budget transfer rather than, as seems to be the case, Canadian Heritage is going to continue to do that. It can provide a central repository for language resources and really act as that liaison between the government and the general public in terms of education and coordination of services. The regional organizations will take care of more of that community capacity building piece that I talked about in the beginning, along with research, development, monitoring, and still more government liaison, especially with the provincial education sector, which is going to be such an important piece of getting languages in schools. So we have really good pieces in place already, pieces that are going to be established through the Act, such as the Office of the Commissioner. And we really think also with that extra piece of a national organization, we can create a strong support network for all of the work that needs to happen going forward for languages. I want to finish with kind of some information for those of you outside of BC on what our next steps are here in British Columbia. You may have heard that November 28th, we now have Bill 41 in BC, Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act. So its purpose is to implement UNDRIP in British Columbia, which is really exciting. Of course, there is a provision in UNDRIP for languages, several articles. So we're really happy about this. At the same time, we don't think it's enough for languages, that we do want to go forward with provincial Indigenous language legislation in British Columbia. So we've begun work with the BC Assembly of First Nations, and we're working to engage the provincial government on this issue of independent languages legislation. A discussion paper was written this summer, and we're forming the working group this fall to take this forward. Both the BC AFN and the UBCIC, two political organizations, have passed resolutions in support of provincial Indigenous language legislation. So we're looking forward to moving forward on this, really to complement the federal legislation in especially those provincial education pieces that don't fall under the mandate of provincial legislation. So I think my time is pretty much up, so I will stop there and see if anyone has any questions.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Also, what exciting times to be doing this. Could I encourage and please invite people who would like to ask a question to ask from here so that our speakers can actually see you. Otherwise, you're just another disembodied voice. Would you be willing to come? Thank you.
My name is Elizabeth, and I just have one short question. Could we access a copy of your presentation? It went by very rapidly. I sat at the back of the room and was not in font 48.
Yeah, sure. We'd be happy to do that. Yeah. And you might want to check out our website too. We have lots of resources on there that are, you know, they're not specific to BC. They can be used for revitalization anywhere.
What's that? Oh.
Hi, my name is Bobby Jill, and I have two questions. One, the presentation would be great to see, but also, if it's not on the website, the discussion paper. And then the next question is we heard from Roger, and I'm not entirely sure if he's still here.
He's gone.
But we've heard on more than one occasion in reference to the Act about the whole of government approach. And I wondered if you had a sense of what that would mean, because I think that means I think the devil may be in the details on that one. So if you have a sense of that, maybe from the work on the table, that would be helpful to understand.
Yeah, so I think the whole of government approach is, you know, this is not just for Canadian heritage or Indigenous services to do in education. You know, language shouldn't be siloed just into those venues and just, you know, especially in education. There's really a need to see Indigenous language made visible across all ministries. So I think it would be looking at things like, just to give you an example of what this could possibly mean, I know there's already been work done with Parks Canada in a couple places in BC here to put signage up in parks that are bilingual in the language of the territory. So that would be one example, but you could imagine, you know, every ministry, there's a need for this, whether it's in health, you could be providing, you know, pamphlets in different languages where there's need on, you know, all those health information things they send out, or, you know, fisheries, there's going to be all sorts of resource areas. So kind of looking at, you know, not just leaving language as a thing for education, but how can we make Indigenous languages visible across the country and really have them recognized and supported and yeah, treasured by all Canadians, not just Indigenous Canadians.
Yeah.
And if you get me your email, maybe Mark can do that and I can share the discussion paper.
Sorry, me again, just to follow up. Just so in the discussions, or nothing's come down to you about what the structure or what maybe a framework or a medicine wheel or a holistic approach might look like, so you don't actually have a sense of that. And then just second part, I just wondered if the, you'll have to excuse me for the acronym of the organization, FCCP? Thank you.
FPCC.
FPCC has contemplated some of the recommendations that were put forward on languages from the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, and how languages might be. So 2 questions. 1, if there's a contemplation on the National Inquiry report, and then 2, if your CEO actually has a sense from working at the AFM table, if what that whole of government approach looks like.
Yeah, I don't think the whole of government approach, the focus has not been on that as yet, as I'm aware in the discussions. Right now, the priority seems to be on establishing the commissioner's office, what's that going to look like and how that's going to get up and running. And also establishing an advisory committee. Again, there's no national organization, which we think is necessary with, you know, fully staffed experts to kind of drive this work. But in the absence of that, someone's going to have to be advising on the funding that rolls out next year already, and how that happens. So as far as I'm aware, the priorities in the discussions right now have been both about the commissioner and a separate advisory committee who's going to be informing Canadian heritage.
Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Max Harlan. I'm from Oneida First Nation. My wife and I, Marcia, have developed Oneida Sign Language. I was just wondering, is there a push or a recognition for your deaf community members to develop the same thing along the same lines for their spoken language?
Yeah, there is an organization, a nonprofit in BC that is a First Nations organization representing deaf people, and they did contact us about what funding was available fairly recently, actually. And so, yeah, I'm not entirely aware of all their work, but certainly they're being in BC, they're eligible to apply for our funding and be supported by our work. So I know there is some interest in that. I'm not sure how large their members are, but yeah, there is definitely some work in that in BC.
Well, regardless of the numbers, they're still entitled to their language.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Hi, Suzanne, just a couple of quick questions. Do you have any sense of the appetite inside the department and inside the AFN for the creation of a national organization as you propose?
Well, I'm not sure that there's movement there yet. The feeling was there was a lot of people at the Cross Canada sessions who said, you know, we don't want a lot of bureaucracy. We don't want, you know, money being taken up by all these levels of different things and by government, you know, taking a cut on the way down. We really want to see money going directly to communities, which we agree with. However, you know, that leaves still the decision-making power in the hands of Canadian Heritage if there's not an organization, Indigenous-led organization to manage that. So I think they're hearing what we're saying. I'm not sure if there's any immediate movement on that, again, because it seems like right now the priority is the Commissioner's office and some other kind of pressing issues. But no one has said, no, this is impossible and it'll never happen, so.
Right, actually the argument may be made that there should be 3 national organizations, one for each of the 3 Indigenous, the constitutionally defined Indigenous peoples. Because I know that in the work that Amos Key and Stephanie Pyle and I have done, we argued in favor of 3 commissioners. And really that was born of the bitter experience of the task force in 2005. I have another question, really a BC question, but it's kind of related to what we heard in the throne speech the other day when the government seemed to be including the possibility of new legislation aligning Canadian laws with UNDRIP at the federal level. And you've gone through this process in BC. And I wondered to what extent have those famous 3 articles in UNDRIP on language, namely 13, 14, and 15, and 16, 13, 14, and 16 in particular, how closely aligned now is BC legislation to those articles? Because it seems to me that as far as education rights go, it's those articles, not C91, that guarantee community use of its language throughout the school system in ways that are controlled by communities and to the fullest extent of the community's desire to have its language as the language of instruction in the school system, and of course funded by public funds. Is that about to happen in BC because of the BC pro-UNDRIP law?
I mean, we hope that's one of the outcomes that'll come from this UNDRIP law. These education provisions, as you say, that's the biggest piece of it. The law's passed. I haven't, you know, I don't think anyone has sort of thought much about how this is actually going to be implemented, but each ministry is getting mandate letters, or already has, on looking at, they're expected to respond on how their individual ministries are going to implement UNDRIP. So yeah, we're really looking to the Ministry of Education there to see what's going to happen in public schools.
Thank you. Wonderful work you're doing out there.
Thank you.
Susan, this is a degree from PCH. So I'm just going to build on the answer that you provided and that Ajay talked about in Stephen. So for the time being, we're working collaboratively with the NIOs to start the implementation of the legislation. The legislation has clear provision that we have to engage with communities widely. So we're currently thinking about how we're going to do that in the future. So for now, we're in a transition period. And so for the funding, as Susan said, it's possible, but this is going to be decided by JISC, who Roger alluded to before, the Joint Implementation Steering Committee, on how exactly this is going to go out. And we did hear the need and the request that Indigenous people are able to participate in the decision making as to what would be funded. So at GISC, they are currently talking about an advisory, an Indigenous review board for making recommendations on funding that could be implemented very soon. But no decision has been made, but we did hear that, and we do take that to heart to implement.
Yeah, thank you very much for that clarification. And yeah, I think the board that's being discussed is a good first step, but I mean, we've been a granting agency for a long time. We have a peer review committee of Indigenous people who make the decisions on our grants, and it is quite it's quite a big operation, let's say, doing that piece of it. I think it is something that's going to take more than just a committee. So that's why we're really pushing for a full organization who will kind of take on that role and some other roles in the long term. But yeah, we're very pleased to see that, you know, that Heritage is listening and certainly cooperating on these things moving forward.
Thank you once again, Suzanne, for your presentation and also for answering all the questions. Thank you for your time. I hope you'll stay online with us as we move to our next presenter, which is Mark Fetis from the Faculty of Education, also joining us from Vancouver, but from Simon Fraser University. And his presentation is on language resurgence through formal schooling, 3 examples from Coast Salish territory. Mark.
Yes, thank you very much, Mark. I just want to mention that twice in the last hour, the system has dumped me off. So my network connection here, I'm in the faculty building, but the network connection seems to be a bit unstable. So I hope it will hang on for another 20 minutes. But I only just managed to clamber back online a moment ago. So my fingers are crossed. I am speaking to you from unceded Coast Salish territory here on in Metro Vancouver, but in fact I'm on top of Burnaby Mountain at one of the 3 campuses of Simon Fraser University, where I work in the Faculty of Education. SFU's 3 campuses are on the territories of a number of First Nations: the Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, Coquitlam, Katzie, Kwantlen, Stolo, Semiahmoo, and others. But all part of Coast Salish territory. And I thought for a start, I'll just share my screen here and show you a map of what that territory is like. Let me just see if I can figure out how to do this. Sorry about this. The computer is asking me for permission, so let's hang on a minute here. The computer tells me I have to quit Zoom in order to share my screen, which perhaps I would be unwise at this point. So regrettably, I cannot show you a map of Coast Salish territory, but it's a vast and fascinating region around the Salish Sea, as it's now called, which extends from Olympia in the south down in Washington State, some 500 kilometers on the north-south axis up to well north of Vancouver, north of Comox and Powell River on the BC coast. And from east to west, over 300 kilometers stretching from the west coast of Vancouver Island, around Port Renfrew, right up the Fraser River to where it turns north and flows through the Fraser Canyon. So it's a vast territory. There's many languages, many Coast Salish languages, all belonging to the same language family, but quite distinct from one another on that territory. And it seemed appropriate for this talk, where I was asked to speak about some of the things that have been going on at SFU, that I focus on the languages of the territory where we are. I just want to say a couple of words about the university itself. Like other universities in BC, SFU was fairly slow to start taking its responsibilities seriously with regards to reconciliation, for want of a better term. So making the university a safe and welcoming and supportive space for Indigenous students, but also rethinking many aspects of how SFU designs and delivers its programs. It wasn't until 2007 that the university came up with its First Nation strategic plan. In 2009, it opened its Office of Aboriginal Peoples. Most recently, in 2016, 2017, it put together a task force co-chaired by the Dean of Education and by a trustee from the Squamish Nation, Chris Lewis. And that task force took a hard look at various aspects of how SFU has been responding to Indigenous aspirations and to the calls for reconciliation, and made a number of quite sweeping recommendations. Just to read you a couple of sentences from the report to give you the flavor. Members of the task force heard that SFU should incorporate meaningful protocols and ceremonies into its current practices. It needs to demonstrate through signage and artwork that these lands are traditional territories, and to convey the deep connections that still exist between the lands and the people who have lived on them for so long. SFU must sweep away barriers to traditional practices and structures, so that compensating elders, holding smudging ceremonies, and operating sweat lodges no longer represent insurmountable logistical and administrative challenges. So that just gives you a sense of what the university is currently wrestling with in their own faculty. And the fact that we are in a period of transition is, I think, reflected in the three programs I'll talk about. So to the programs, I don't have a lot of time. I'm going to briefly describe a couple that I was not personally involved in, and then at slightly greater length, a project that I'm now working on. The two examples that I want to profile as it were case studies of the kinds of things SFU is doing with and for the languages at the moment include first an undergraduate immersion program in Squamish Sneakjim, the language of the Squamish Nation. This is being taught at our Vancouver campus as a 1-year intensive immersion program. Essentially, students enroll only in this program for 1 year. The first year comprises about 900 hours of language immersion. Technically, it involves 9 different undergraduate courses, all of which are part of SFU's academic calendar. So students do get academic credit for this. But the important thing, I think, to highlight is that it is a partnership with Kwialt Stelmach, the Squamish Language Academy. And it's essentially, although it takes place on our Vancouver campus, it's essentially in many respects an Indigenous controlled space where ceremony, protocol, knowledge holders from the nation are all involved in the way that the language is taught. And I think it's important to acknowledge that although the description of the language sounds very much like any other second language learning program, you know, that you'll learn to converse with on a number of subjects, describe people and objects, talk about situations in the past, present, and future, etc. But I think the really important philosophy of the program was expressed by KALEIMAMOOWAHINEKAPU, a young leader from the Squamish Nation, currently on the band council, and a speaker for the nation on a number of current issues. He expressed the idea that the program is linked to the elders' perception that the Squamish people have been losing their values like generosity and compassion. And to quote, "They felt that was because our language had started to disappear and that people weren't speaking the language anymore. If the language came back, those values would come back with it, and we see that. When people learn the language, they learn the culture, and they learn how to treat each other differently, how to think differently, and how to behave differently than what the English language gives us. The language gives us back a huge chunk of that and makes us stand tall again and makes us united in a way that I don't think anything other than our language can grant us." So I think it's important to say that, that part of the university's role, I feel here, is to make space for programs where these values and these aspirations can be enacted without the university telling people how to do things. A second example is a graduate program taking place on Hulkaminam speaking territory on the coast of Vancouver Island and centered in the town of Duncan. In just this past summer, in our June convocation ceremony, 24 students received a Master of Arts degree from the Department of Linguistics through the First Nations language program. And this cohort of 24 students, well, or group of 24 students, included 2 cohorts of 12, one of students from a number of language groups who met up here on Burnaby Mountain, and the other 12 who were all Hulkaminam speakers and based in Duncan, BC, where SFU does not have a campus. And so this is an interesting example of a graduate program entirely based in community and entirely grounded in the linguistics and the culture of a single language group. Donna Gertz, who's the SFU professor who headed this program in Duncan, thinks that it may be unique in North America as a master's program dedicated solely to the speakers of a single language. I'm just passing that on as her thought about how unusual such a program is. And what's more, this cohort of 12 speakers was intergenerational. It included fathers and daughters, brothers, sisters, cousins, all studying together. I think it's also important to say that although Donna, who herself is non-Indigenous and is a specialist in the linguistics of Hulkaminam and related Coast Salish dialects, although she played an important leadership role, both Denise Augustine, who is the district principal of School District 79 in Duncan and surrounding territories, and Ruby Peter, who is an elder to whom SFU gave an honorary doctorate in the same ceremony this last summer, and who has dedicated her life to the cause of the revitalization and preservation of Hulkaminam. I think it's important to say that the program in Duncan would have been impossible without the leadership of these and other First Nations people from the area. And again, the merit of this program, I feel, is both that it took place in community, so that it was accessible to people working full-time jobs who met in evenings and on the weekends over the course of 2 or 3 years in order to get through the coursework and to complete their master's projects required for the degree. And in the way that it was organized and taught, it drew heavily on the knowledge, the values, and the protocols of the Hulkaminam speaking people. So now to the third example, and this is the one that I am involved in currently myself. And to start with, I want to acknowledge that inevitably the numbers of students who are reached by these university programs, such as the Squamish language program, such as the Hulkaminam program, are small. Each year from the Squamish program, there have been 15 graduates. Each year, or in this 2-year master's program from the Hulkaminam program cohort, there were 12 graduates. So these are small numbers, but of course what is important is that these people are not only deepening their own knowledge of the language and their own capacities to work with the language, but very often they go into employment, or they upgrade the employment that they have working with schools. School districts in BC are the major employers of First Nations people with language expertise, language skills. And so in that way, school districts play a vital role in the overall economic and social ecology of the languages. Yet as we all know, I think, there's a real risk in aligning Indigenous language learning too closely with the school system. These 2 university programs, as I've been emphasizing, have been effective because to an extent they provide a space that can be shaped according to Indigenous protocol and relationship. But the scope for doing that in the public school system tends to be much narrower. The languages are most often taught in short bursts, say a 45-minute lesson, tucked in amongst a day of unrelated topics and activities. It is rarely the classroom teacher, the regular classroom teacher, who has proficiency in the language. Almost always it is a language specialist who makes a scheduled appearance 1, 2, or 3 times a week. Students in school cannot but be aware of this dichotomy. The language is not at home in the schools, just as schools in their teachings and daily routines tend not to be at home on the territory where they find themselves. It's interesting that now in BC, you have recognition, partly tacit, but also partly explicit, of this fact, of the fact that schools are not at home on the territories where they find themselves, in the BC curriculum and in the documents produced by the Ministry of Education. In the current curriculum, which was adopted in 2015, teachers are explicitly encouraged to teach in ways that respect the place in which the students are, to teach from within the school and its surrounding community, as the curriculum says. And this principle is explicitly linked to the mandate on all teachers in the BC school system to integrate Indigenous knowledge and perspectives across the curriculum, not just as a little part of the social studies curriculum or somewhere else. The 60 school districts we have here in BC vary enormously in how they are dealing with this challenge, in the journey that they've already been on, in the partnerships that they have with local nations and Indigenous partners. And the central challenge that they're all facing is that of teacher capacity. The fact is that most public school teachers in BC as elsewhere in Canada know very little of Indigenous history, culture, or values, nor are they trained or experienced in approaches to place-based education. To the ministry's credit, it has published a number of resources that are aimed at helping teachers take initial steps on this path. But the extraordinary ecological and cultural and linguistic diversity of BC that Suzanne referred to in her prior talk means that most of the work that teachers do, most of this work of tying schooling to place, to culture, to language, to land, has to take place locally, district by district, and even school by school. So my question is, what can universities, what can SFU do about this? How can we help make schools safer places or more hospitable places for Indigenous languages? It seems clear to me that programs of the kind I've profiled so far, the Squamish program, the Hulkaminam program, do little to make schools safer places for Indigenous languages. In fact, to the extent that they reinforce the tendency to think of the languages and teach the languages in isolation from the rest of the curriculum, as languages as an autonomous subject on its own, they seem to me symptomatic of the more general problem of colonization. To treat language as a thing in its own, distinct from the world around it, mirrors the separation of people from land that lies at the heart of the colonial project. Decolonizing Indigenous language education requires us to think of language and world, or people and land, together, to think of education indeed as a cultivation of wholeness, an undoing of separation. So the third example I wish to briefly profile in closing is a partnership that I am building currently with the school district to the north of Duncan, the town where the Hulkaminam program took place that I mentioned in my second example. This is school district 68, Nanaimo Ladysmith, which is likewise situated on Hulkaminam speaking territory. My work in the district started on Gabriola Island, one of the Gulf Islands, situated a 20-minute ferry ride out of Nanaimo Harbor. The school on Gabriola, which is part of the school district, decided some years ago to work towards becoming a place-based school. At that time, in 2014, reconciliation was not part of the conversation as far as I know. Colonial dispossession on Gabriola was completed some generations ago. As a symbolic fact, I will mention that the lone First Nations reserve on Gabriola, an island of some 57 square kilometers or 5,700 hectares, is a tiny parcel of land, a single hectare, 1 hectare in size. However, in the 2 years between 2016, when I first started coming over to Gabriola, and 2018, when I got the first grant to support this work, I observed a groundswell of interest, both in the school and the community at large, in coming to terms with the colonial and Indigenous history of Gabriola, and in the process, rebuilding relationships with the Indigenous title holders, in particular, the Snuneymuxw First Nation, on whose land Nanaimo is situated. We've come to call this project on Gabriola Intergenerational Land-Based Learning for Reconciliation. The idea is to rethink and reorient the entire curriculum of the school eventually, to infuse it with Indigenous understandings of land, culture, and relationship, and to embed it in learning on and with the land and with the community as a whole. As a central aspect of this work, we are building relationships with Snuneymuxw knowledge holders, in particular Elder Bill White, who is guiding us towards a deeper understanding of Coast Salish territory and teachings and values, which he sees as foundational for education on Coast Salish territory. But what is remarkable, I think, is that this work on Gabriola, which has developed more or less on its own terms in response to the ideas and questions of school and community members, is mirrored by developments in the school district. In January 2019, so well after we'd begun this work on the island, the district published a new policy on reconciliation, known as the CILLDI framework, for a Hulkaminam term meaning walking together. This was the product of 1.5 years of dialogue among district leaders and knowledge holders from 5 Indigenous partners, including SNAIMO. And the framework identifies land, culture, and language as the foundations of reconciliation. And I quote briefly, "CILLDI begins by understanding and embracing the teachings of this land on which we live and work as a basis for our journey to truth and reconciliation. These complex knowledge systems can only be fully appreciated by first understanding and recognizing the relationship between the land, language, and culture." I probably don't need to underscore for you how profound the challenge is that this formulation implies. In a talk with the district superintendent a couple of months ago, he told me that the CILLDI framework is now influencing their discussions about everything in the district, far beyond how they originally thought of it. And this represents for me another capacity that the university, like SFU, can bring to the table. We can support the journeys of inquiry that schools and school districts are on. Some of this can be built into this research project that I've initiated. But I've also begun talks with the district about designing a master's program inspired by the CILLDI framework. That is a program in which the connections between land, culture, language, and education are the central theme, the focus of learning and exploration. Obviously, such a program has to be co-designed and co-delivered with the local land-based nations and knowledge holders. Fortunately, our faculty is already doing this kind of work. In the past year, we wrapped up 2 different programs, 2-year programs on Katzie and Kwantlen territory, east of Vancouver, and on Tsleil-Waututh and Squamish territory in North Vancouver, both of which were designed and delivered in close partnership with those nations and involving ceremony and Indigenous knowledge holders and Indigenous protocols. So what will we learn about teaching the languages through this new partnership on Hulkaminam speaking territory? I honestly don't know at this point, but this does seem to me to be the kind of work that universities and school districts need to be doing together in response to the calls to action. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Digital Mark. We have a couple of minutes for questions and comments from anybody in the audience.
Sugoli Mark. Hi, Sugoli. I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Marcia Ireland, and I am from Oneida. I would like to thank you for your presentation. And I know that your focus has been on Indigenous spoken languages, but my focus is on Indigenous sign languages. And here in Ontario, it's required for Indigenous deaf children to have an IEP. And in that IEP will state that the child is to learn American Sign Language or English. And so this is a source of frustration for me because I really want those children to be able to connect with their own language and therefore the culture. And those children then grow up and struggle through their lives once they graduate out of the elementary or high school and then go into post-secondary. And I see those students frustrated because they're unable to connect with their own identity because it's not in their own language. So that's one point. And another issue that I see quite often is with Indigenous deaf children and the language that they will use. Quite often they will receive criticism for the language they have, and I want to intervene in those moments and say, but wait a second, it's connected to their land and their culture and their home. So it's almost like a double violation that happens to these children. And so I've taken a position of being an advocate and trying to advocate and educate. And sometimes, I'm invited to go just kind of as a one-time or on occasion, but it needs to be ongoing and not just, just this, like you were mentioning, somebody coming and going for 45 minutes or a couple of times a week. I had been invited to George Brown College. Sorry, I'm the interpreter again. There's an interpreting program here at George Brown College, and I had met an Indigenous student who was attending that interpreting program, and they felt it was a disconnect from what they were learning in that program was a disconnect from their own culture and identity. And so I've taken it as one of my kind of goals is to work with that person and kind of maybe be the prick to keep them going. But overall, I'm feeling like this singular person leading this charge. And I am fearless in that I will stand up and I will continue to ignite the flame that Indigenous sign languages are important. And I agree that it is Indigenous spoken languages are vitally important. But for me, it's my languages with my hands, and that's what's important. And it's very emotional for me, but I really thank you for the work that you're doing. I thank you for sharing your time with us and sharing your knowledge.
Thank you. I really salute the work that you are doing. I agree very much that the experience of lack of support and lack of even understanding of what a student may need to feel supported and to feel empowered in their learning journey is a general problem. That this work around the languages is part of the larger work of making educational institutions safe and supportive and nurturing places for students to learn and grow as people. And one doesn't have to look far in the history of Western education to see how deliberately schools, and to a lesser extent universities, were shaped as colonizing institutions. Colonizing, as it were, all the way down, not just at the level of language and culture, but even to the separation of individuals from their families, from their communities, from their roots, so that they might become part of this mobile, deracinated, and relatively docile workforce. So undoing that work, the colonial work of the school system, is a long, long process, and I agree that the integration of an understanding of deaf culture, of indigeneity, and of the ways those intersect is a really excellent example of the kinds of things that our institutions currently do very sporadically, if at all. So I think it's terrific, important work that you're doing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark, again for your presentation, also for answering that question, that comment so carefully and thoughtfully. Thank you. And time and trying to catch up with ourselves a little bit, we'll now move to my colleague, Candace GALLA, who is at the Institute for Critical Indigenous Studies and also the Faculty of Education at UBC in Vancouver. Welcome, Candace.
Aloha mai kākou. Can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, and you can see my slides?
Yes.
Great. So I'll start officially. Aloha pumehana kākou. O wau no o Candace KALEIMAMOOWAHINEKAPU GALLA. No Hawaii mai au, he Hawaii au. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm currently sharing this presentation from the traditional, unceded, and ancestral territory of the Hunkaminam Musqueam speaking people of what is now known as Vancouver. I'd also like to recognize that through digital means, this is also being shared on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations where York University is now situated. The area known as Toronto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Huron-Wendat, and the Métis. My presentation is titled The Promise and Potential of Digital Technology to Support Indigenous Language Revitalization. Today I'm speaking as a Native Hawaiian, Hawaiian language speaker and learner, Indigenous scholar, educator, researcher, and professor in the Department of Language and Literacy Education in the Faculty of Education, as well as the Institute for Critical Studies, Critical Indigenous Studies in the Faculty of Arts at the University of British Columbia. So I'll begin with a review of UNDRIP and Bill C-91 in relation to digital technology and media. Some of us may be already familiar with these, but in red, I've highlighted particular wording in regards to technology. So we have Article 11 here. Let me see if I can move my screen. Okay. This includes the right to maintain, protect, and develop past, present, and future manifestations of their cultures, and this includes technologies. And Article 16, which has been referenced throughout the day in regards to establishing their own media in language. And Article 31, having the right to maintain, control, protect, and develop cultural heritage, again, as well as manifestations of their sciences, technologies, and cultures. I'll move on to the next, which is the Indigenous Languages Act. And there are two instances within this act that bring up technology. So one is in the purpose to create technological tools, and then within the mandate to support innovative projects and the use of new technologies in Indigenous language education and revitalization. So over the last 3 days in Paris, an international conference on language technologies for all, enabling linguistic diversity and multilingualism worldwide was held. There were presentations from all across the globe, from Indigenous peoples, researchers, academics, with representation from First Peoples Cultural Council by the CEO, Tracy Herbert, as well as Dr. Lorna Williams of UVic. It was quite interesting to hear the presentations and conversations that are being had. Both UNDRIP and Bill C-91 inform the work and research that I do, which lead me into two frameworks that can be used to help determine the technology use in Indigenous communities. So maybe some of us are familiar with SWOT. If you're not, SWOT is a strategic planning technique used to help individuals or organizations, community, and so forth to identify strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats related to project planning. So this can be used in decision-making situations when a desired end state or objective or goal is defined. In this case, I'm applying a SWOT analysis to determine, again, the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats of digital, new, and emerging technology for the purpose of Indigenous language education, broadly defined. So if we're using the terms, again, revitalization, maintenance, reclamation, resurgence. So this is just one method to help us work through and evaluate and reveal the promise and potential and hindrances of digital technology. The outcome is that this analysis recognizes the situation at a given time, and based on these factors, a plan of action can be established. In the face of changing demands, resources, and globalization, we understand that the context of Indigenous languages are always changing, which require a constant reevaluation by community stakeholders. Now here's another framework called the Technocy Framework for Language Revitalization. But I'll start with the term Technocy. Technocy is the ability to understand, communicate, and exploit the characteristics of technology to discern how human technological practice is necessarily a holistic engagement with the world that involves people, tools, and the consumed environment, driven by purpose and contextual considerations. And this is from Kurt Seaman, 2009. The Technocy framework by Seaman and Talbot in 1995 is defined as a holistic approach to perceiving, teaching, practicing, and learning technology in any culture. In terms of outcome, we seek to produce skilled, holistic thinkers and doers who can use appropriate technologies that are responsive to local context and needs. The framework that you see here has been reconceptualized to reference Indigenous languages. So the Technocy Framework for Language Revitalization, or what I call TFLR, includes 5 components that are required to determine the appropriateness of the use of technology in Indigenous language learning and teaching. So these include linguistic and cultural contextual factors, social contextual factors, economic, environmental, and technological contextual factors. Each of these factors requires consideration of the other 4 to help determine the appropriateness and usefulness of digital, new, and emerging technologies, again, in response to local context and individual or community goals, which varies tremendously for each community. As each Indigenous community has its own complexities and ideologies, a discussion about digital technology can be a contentious matter. The TFLR is provided as a starting point to help stakeholders discuss and maybe later determine if technology is a practical option that will lead to their language goals. And like SWOT, this will require a re-evaluation as needed. So now I'll share some examples that pertain to Hawaiian language, and we'll speak to the challenges and opportunities that exist with digital technology. In 2009, Apple added Hawaiian support in its operating system for the iPhone 3, which included 2 diacritical markers, the kahako, the macron, which is placed over the vowel to indicate vowel length, and the okina, which is a glottal stop, which is a consonant that indicates a break in a sound or word. During the same year, Google in Olelo, Hawaii, which is pictured here, was also released as part of the Google in Your Language program, which encouraged the translation of Google products in minority and Indigenous languages. According to Kalena Silva, who was the current director of the College of Hawaiian Language at the University of Hawaii at Hilo, he stated, "Google is the most heavily used search engine on the internet. And from a practical and a symbolic standpoint, this interface puts Hawaiian on par with many other languages that Google currently supports." Kiel O'Donoghue, who's been involved with these technological innovations from the 1990s with Hawaiian language and has also been instrumental with Google, states it's our mission to ensure that the Hawaiian language stays contemporary. To ignore modern technology would suggest that our language doesn't belong. The digital opportunities continue with Bank of Hawaii, inclusion of Hawaiian as one of the language options at select ATMs, with the intention to expand throughout the state of Hawaii and to serve the growing subgroup of Hawaiian language speakers. Kali'i Wilson, who is a graduate of our Hawaiian language medium education and director at the time of the Hawaii Tourism Authority's Hawaiian Cultural Affairs and head of the project, spoke about translation of banking terms from English to Hawaiian. And she says, "We didn't have to start from scratch," noting that some of the words used in the interface, such as pila kiko'o or check, were borrowed from ads and articles in Hawaiian language newspapers dating back to the 1860s. Now, more recently, in 2016, Hawaiian has been included as one of the newest languages to Google Translate. Google says that it scans the internet for billions of already translated text and uses machine learning to identify statistical patterns at enormous scale so our machines can learn the language. But as we know, the existing documents cannot cover the breadth of nuances of a language, therefore relies on, in this case, Hawaiian language speakers to contribute correct interpretation of words, phrases, and sentences to help improve Google Translate. An audio resource that has been made available within the last 3 years is on Ulukau, or our Hawaiian Electronic Library. And here is pictured Larry Kimura. And maybe some of us are familiar with Larry Kimura. He is a professor at the University of Hawaii at Hilo in Kahakaula o Ke'elikulani College of Hawaiian Language. This audio resource, Kani Aina, or Voices of the Land, was made available within the last 3 years on Ulukau. And this is a program that began in 1972 and continued for 16 years of broadcasting. And these are recordings of Mana Leo, or native speakers, that includes 393 recorded programs, totaling 502 hours of original recordings on 7-inch reels. Many of these, or all of these, were accessible to students and professors at the universities, but now this is made available to the wider public. And now you see a screenshot of an email that I received back in 2017. So it says, "Aloha kakahiaka, Candace." And I highlighted or underlined a few of these sentences. "We are currently working on an acoustic data collection project involving native speakers of various languages, Hawaiian amongst others. The data we collate is used in development of machine learning projects. We have a simple task that can be performed from home on an Android device or a computer laptop of any brand with a stable internet connection. In the task, participants are required to record 600 utterances in Hawaiian. It shouldn't take longer than an hour and 15 minutes, for which they are compensated $40 in US via PayPal." I don't know how many of us receive these kinds of requests, but this is a common occurrence every year. And so I reached out to this person and said, thank you for reaching out to me. This sounds like an interesting project. I wanted to be very positive about this. And I'd like to learn more about it. So I asked, could you share with me the particular interest in Hawaiian language and how these recordings will be used, and for what purpose is this? I look forward to hearing back from you. The response I received: to answer your questions, the acoustic data we collate will be passed on to our client, who is one of the world's largest technology companies. The data will be used in the development of speech recognition technology, leading to more intuitive natural language interactions with machines. Examples of these intelligent machines include virtual assistants such as Siri, Alexa, or Cortana, who need to be taught to recognize the language of their users, in our instance, Native Hawaiians. I'm not sure whether this answers your questions, but to be fair, there isn't much more to it. Feel free to register via the link. The page provides more information about the task. So I questioned whether I was being maybe paranoid about this and reached out to my friends and colleagues back home in Hawaii to see what their reaction would be. One responded and said, "We have not participated in these things. I actually looked into it, and at one point I saw that it wasn't for us. The focus is not really on revitalizing the language among people, but rather automatic translations. There's lots of challenges involved too." And then another Native Hawaiian professor and language speaker questioned, "Are you selling this info back to us and the world? Are you trademarking our Olelo, or language?" And the response she received was, "We are helping to develop modern speech recognition systems. Unfortunately, these systems usually neglect to implement minority languages and focus mainly on commonly spoken languages like English, Spanish, or Chinese. We strongly believe in preserving a large diversity in languages and cultures. This knowledge will help in any future research endeavors, so no language and no culture will be left behind. If you have any doubt of concern, please write us and we will be more than glad to answer your questions." Now the professor then responds and she says, "My question is, how is the work of our community, meaning the Hawaiian community, going to be used? Is this a matter of signing people up on contract, developing a resource, and then selling it back to us while this company owns the data? I want to know what application this data has potentially in the future, and what rights we sell off to our traditional knowledge when we work for you and sign a contract for a one-time fee." Again, these are not one-offs. I received another a few months ago, and this was an English to Hawaiian translation project from an established translation company asking to translate 1,800 words for a $160 negotiable fee. So there are a lot of questions that come up, but I was reaffirmed through conversations and communication with other colleagues and Native Hawaiian language speakers back home that this is something that we should really be questioning. So is this a translation request or is it something else? And lastly, in 2018, so more recently, Duolingo released the beta version in 2 Indigenous languages, one Diné Bazad or Navajo and Olelo Hawaii. At first, when this was released, I was thinking about who is the audience? Who is benefiting from an app like this? But recently, I would say within the last year or so, I've learned that Duolingo is for our Hawaiian community who are relearning language, whether it is parents of children who are in our Hawaiian immersion schools, but it's also being accessed by Hawaiian language learners across the globe as well, whether they're Native Hawaiian or not. So as I've shared some of these examples of technology that are based in Hawaiian language or trying to engage with Hawaiian language, this leads me to ask, again, the following questions. Now, these are just some, and we can likely add to this list. But this is for us to consider when engaging with digital technology initiatives and projects that involve Indigenous languages. So again, what are the benefits of technology or this particular technology project? Well, how does this help to achieve language goals or maybe broadly community goals? Who is benefiting from this technology? Is it actually the community? And is the audience the community, or is it non-community members? Who is it actually being marketed to? Who has access? Who was it developed by? Was there any consultation that was done if it's not community-led or based? Where was it developed? What is the intention or purpose? What is the cost? And is it being sold back to community, as one of the Native Hawaiian professors asked? Is there community capacity building in developing a technology like this? How does this contribute, again, to language reclamation, revitalization, education, and maintenance efforts? How does this empower the community? We're creating and material just in a different form. What are the impacts on the community, whether they're the elders or language speakers, and who owns the rights? And what commitment and responsibility is there throughout the process and then beyond the launch date of these technology projects? So these are, again, some questions that I often think about when we engage in the development of new technology, or maybe an app is developed. These are really great to think about what potential it has for Indigenous communities, but these are also some things that we have to consider when we're engaging with technology, and especially Indigenous languages. So the impact itself, the impact for Bill C-91 is great in that it has the potential to revalorize, renormalize, create, invest, and prioritize opportunities for Indigenous languages, but also as a way for digital technology initiatives to contribute to Indigenous language revitalization, reclamation, education, and promotion. So we all have a role and responsibility in restoring Indigenous languages, whether it is through revitalizing, reclaiming, education, promotion, advocacy, support as an Indigenous person or ally. Collectively, we need to prioritize original languages of what we now know as Canada and Indigenous languages elsewhere, and provide support to breathe the life and resources back into communities to not only restore language, culture, knowledge systems, identity, and well-being, but also to restore the relationships to humans and the more than humans. Mahalo anui.
Mahalo, Candace. Thank you for doing what you do so well, which is showing both opportunity but also some of the challenges, reminding us, of course, that when a product is free, usually we are ourselves the product. We have a little bit of time for questions and comments. I welcome anyone.
Hi, my name is Adam. I'm working on a dictionary project, an online dictionary project. So I think I have an idea what you're speaking of. I'd like to know what you see as the practical applications of the work you're doing right now, other than another website like I'm doing. What else is the technology? What else can you harness the technology for that you're not already able to do?
Well, I should start by saying that I've been at UBC for the last 8 years, and I've worked with one particular community in the interior of BC. And some of the work that I've done over the last 15 years really investigates how Indigenous language communities are utilizing technology. And being a part of a university for such a long time, universities are such privileged places that we have the highest technologies, computer labs, or, you know, I don't know if those are out of date now, but thinking of the technologies that universities are afforded with. Communities, on the other hand, some are equipped with these high-tech initiatives, while others are still dealing and grappling with getting infrastructure for community. So I have a course that I've developed, Materials Development for Indigenous Language Learning and Teaching, and we use the Technocy framework in our class to really help students understand that all communities are not the same, and whether we're, you know, 5 miles out of the city or 5 hours away from the city, we really need to localize those efforts and think about what capacity there is in the community. And so we've been creating materials for one of the interior Salish languages. And again, thinking of if we're creating high technology initiatives or large kinds of files that maybe communities aren't able to access because there isn't good infrastructure like broadband technology, then we really need to rethink our deliverables or our output. And that's not to say in the near future that there isn't capacity for that, but again, meeting the community where they are right now. But I think, you know, there's so much opportunities with technology. So the work that you're doing with online dictionaries, I think it is really great. One of the I guess examples I have with Hawaii with our dictionaries, we've had our dictionaries digitized and available online from our very first dictionaries back in the 1800s. And so this has been a great resource for us because not all of us are carrying around our paper or hardcover dictionaries. But it's nice to think about what new opportunities there are with our Hawaiian language dictionaries, whether that could be including audio or maybe even linking to some of these stories from our native Hawaiian language speakers from prior. And so I think there's more opportunities to engage with our existing technologies, but also to keep on adding to it. I guess the new technology that I often think about now is virtual reality and augmented reality. Now, these aren't necessarily cheap technology initiatives, but this has a potential to really immerse language learners and teachers potentially, and diaspora in reconnecting to land, reconnecting to language, reconnecting to culture. And so I think these are some exciting opportunities, again, that technology has to offer. But again, not all of us are afforded with these same kinds of technology.
Ask a quick follow-up and then I'll go.
Yes.
Are Indigenous students being trained to do the actual tech work?
So within the course that I teach or that I just completed is taught through the Institute for Critical Indigenous Studies, which houses the First Nations and Endangered Languages program. So I would say about 50% are Indigenous students that were in my particular class. So it's actually nice to see that there are a growing number of Indigenous students, not only interested, but in these courses so they can take up this work and take it back to their community.
Very good. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Hello, my name is Marsha Ireland. It's fantastic that you have such resources and technology. So for me, I'm focusing more on the sign language. And as you were just mentioning, one of the biggest issues is out in the First Nations, we don't have access to the files that other people may have access to. Like you were saying, you know, the download would be pretty slow. I have been working in revitalizing Oneida Sign Language, and that has been one of the issues is we've been trying to connect the Oneida sign with the Oneida spoken language. And so to align those two has been a bit of a challenge, and we have been successful, but it was not easy, for sure. And, you know, as you know, when you're recording an auditory, when you're doing an auditory recording, you need to have a silent soundproof room to get the quality. And for our Oneida elders, they were it was very unsettling for them to be in this room. So it just presents different challenges. And it is, it asks us to kind of stretch our cultural bounds. And even, you know, I will create an Oneida Sign Language video, and then when I review my work, I'm like, ooh, that's not, you know, exactly what I thought the outcome would be. So I'm wondering if you are aware of any technology that's being used with Hawaiian deaf individuals?
Thank you for your question. I am not familiar at all with what is happening in Hawaii in regards to deaf culture there. But what is interesting, I could say that I could speak a little to. I returned back home to the College of Hawaiian Language. So this is at the University of Hawaii at Hilo. And it's quite a new building within, I think built within the last maybe 5 years or so. And so there is Braille on the signage, classroom signage and things like that when you enter the classroom. And so because this is a College of Hawaiian Language, the sign is in Hawaiian. In English, it's in Braille, and then there's also Braille in Hawaiian language. And so that is quite interesting and a new thing that I didn't learn about until probably the last 2 years or so. So I definitely know this is a concern when we're thinking about inclusive of all languages, inclusive of all Indigenous languages, and this includes sign language as well. So again, when we think of languages, sometimes we're privileging languages that have a standard orthography, but we also have to remember that there are many communities that don't have that opportunity to have a written language, let alone those of us who are signing languages as well. So mahalo for that question, and I will definitely be following up with my colleagues back home to see what opportunities there are. Mahalo.
Candace, for using digital technology to talk about digital technology. It's great to see you, and thank you again for your presentation. So I think we better turn to our last presenter of this session, and that is Heather Blair. Heather joins us from the Faculty of Education at the University of Alberta in Edmonton at the Canadian Indigenous Language and Literacy Development Institute, known to many as CILLDI, and she'll be speaking about CILLDI in the absence of a policy, alignment with the Indigenous Languages Act, its emergence. Heather.
Hello. Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, is that loud enough?
It's great.
Okay, I'm going to try and get my my PowerPoint up here too. Here we go. Thank you very much, Sinigay. Tanseakwa, Heather Blair, and Siga soon. Nakoma, Saskatchewan, Nochinia. Now I work at the University of Alberta. Still miss my home in Saskatchewan, but I've been here long enough to almost be acclimated. Some of you are familiar with CILLDI, some of you won't be. I do recognize a few familiar faces or voices in the room and on the screen. So I'm hoping that this isn't redundant for you. I do have quite a bit of text on these screens, and I would, are you seeing the side screen as well?
Yes, you are.
Okay, well, I don't quite know how to get on with that. Let me just see, view.
It plays. Do you want to just play on the slideshow? Yeah.
Oh yeah, okay, where are we? Slideshow, play. From the beginning. There we go. There we go. I'm not one of those people who does the digital courses. I'd like to recognize some folks before I start here. Our Elder Margaret Cardinal, my colleague Linda Pelly, who has worked with me and teaches at CILLDI over many years. A small Indigenous Women's Language Council that I work with, and the late Donna Paskaman, who was one of the founders of CILLDI. We have over time had some sponsors that I'll hope to remember as well at the end of this, but I just wanted to continue to move along here. And when I say the absence of policy in my title, I guess I meant the absence of a formal policy, because needing to recognize that there are policies at work all of the time, whether they're actually ever written down policies or they're just enacted in formal policies. We need to remember that they impact and can get in the way of what we're doing as well. I won't read all these slides, but I do have an abstract here I'll just speak to for a minute. CILLDI's been around for a long time prior to the new Indigenous Languages Act, and I'm hoping to present some examples of policy at both a local level, micro examples that give us some things to think, food for thought, or food for fodder, whatever that is, thoughts to give us some ways to think about how does policy impact us all the way around, and then how does it impact up to the bigger policy. And I'm suggesting that we've been working in a paradigm of language revitalization for these 20 years, and language retention and language retrieval. But as I look around at the international, what people are doing internationally, I think that, and I think locally, we're at a place to look more at a kind of language reclamation model that maybe we haven't gone quite deep enough in all of this, and need to think about what else we could be doing. And people like Sheila Nicholas and Teresa McCarty elaborate very clearly what a language reclamation could look like. And yes, it includes all those earlier works of creating new generations of speakers, but it's more than that. It's more profoundly linked to the kinds of things people have been talking about in these sessions, to land, to, I love the term civilization, Amos, as opposed to culture. Self-determination, well-being, reconstruction of these ways and ideologies. So I am hopeful that a young, when I say young, a program we've been running for 10 years, it's kind of an offshoot of CILLDI that we call the Young Indigenous Women's Circle of Leadership. We're really trying to delve deeper into these kinds of things alongside language learning and teaching into a more reclamation model. CILLDI began 20 years ago. We had our 20th birthday party this summer. We started with a kind of build it and they will come notion. We started with one class, a Cree class with 14 students, and each year added a few classes. Course development obviously was always ongoing. It's the kind of thing that never stops for those of you who work in program development. I don't say on this screen, but we are a 3-unit entity, the Faculty of Native Studies, the Faculty of Arts, primarily linguistics, and the Faculty of Education. And we offer courses in each of these areas. We have developed a kind of core program over time. Our regular offerings, of which includes a community linguist certificate, which is 6 courses through linguistics, and Indigenous Languages Education component, which is 6 courses, and these are undergrad courses. Sadly, and I would say this is tied to numerous factors, and one of which being policy, is that currently we only offer one Cree Immersion for Adult Beginners course, and that's our only Indigenous language course. And I'm being very frank here that, you know, we have some long ways to go. And I'm hopeful, though, that this federal policy will filter down to provincial policy, to post-secondary policies, and we'll have more support in this kind of area. We have operated since the beginning on a shoestring budget. We have never had any kind of significant funding other than our provost gives us a little bit of bursary money. We have had some pockets of funding from smaller funding agencies. So we do know, you know, I have pretty good understanding of how lack of policy impacts funding, impacts what you can do and might do. That being said, I still say, you know, build it and they will come. Our capacity building is ongoing. I feel very fortunate that in the Faculty of our educational offerings at CILLDI, we offer 6 or 7 courses every summer. CILLDI is only a summer program, I must say that as well. And of those 7 courses offered last summer, I am the only non-Indigenous faculty teaching. And granted, these are not all full-time faculty people. There are many sessional instructors, but they are all either people with PhDs or working on PhDs, Indigenous language speakers from across languages, people like Linda Pelly, Dr. Barb Latterud, Belinda Daniels, Valvolie Georges, who come and work with us each summer, highly committed individuals that we're very fortunate to have. So at CILLDI, we teach the languages, we teach about languages, and we teach how to teach languages. So those are the contributions of the 3 faculties. Near the beginning of the development of CILLDI, Verna Curtness came here for a conference, and we have really tried to follow Verna's model of advice of, you know, here are some things you need to do, you know, starting with, you know, mobilizing resources and banking languages, and develop comprehensive and appropriate curriculums, those kinds of things you're familiar with from Verna's work. And press for Aboriginal language legislation, which she was saying 20 years ago. I believe she was one of the first people to talk about a commissioner for Indigenous languages. And so, you know, we have through our courses, and we offer about 15 courses, 12 to 15 distinct courses each summer. We have quite, you know, we have addressed, I would say, all of those kinds of directives from Verna, some in more depth and some more successfully, but certainly have been informed by that. We've had almost 2,000 students in these. Our count this summer was 1,900, and representing at least 30 Indigenous languages. Primarily, our students come from Western and Northern Canada, but we have had students from Ontario, the Maritimes. I think we've only ever had 1 or 2 students from Quebec. You know, and so we are a multilingual program. Our students bring their language experience. They're in courses with others from across Canada who bring their own languages. So just generally the kind of awareness that each student takes away in terms of the languages of Canada is huge in, you know, 1 summer alone. You know, I wanted to, and my paper does address this more elaborately, examples of policy issues at our institution and in our province that, you know, have gotten in the way over time as to what we can do and have done. We would like to, you know, we like to see ourselves as having a language as resource orientation. Language is not a problem, and yes, it's a right, but it's more than that. It's a resource, and it's a resource to Indigenous knowledges, and we celebrate. We try to do as many things as we can to celebrate languages. That being said, we had a past Dean of Native Studies who set down a local policy saying that our Cree Immersion for Adult Beginners course could not be counted towards a Native Studies degree because it could be taken by students at a distance, and that was fine, but that it wasn't academic, that an oral language is not an academic subject. So it's that kind of thinking that still exists, and policies sit in places that impede. So we have, you know, not been able to do some of the kind of growth we would have loved to been able to do in that faculty around languages, the teaching of languages, because of that kind of policy. We had another policy where people applying to our university to take courses, even if they were mature students or summer students, there was a question on the application form: do you speak a language other than English? Did you first learn a language other than English? And of course, these are the people we want, but our students say yes. And then they get a letter back from the university saying, well, have you passed a TOEFL or an IELTS? And our students go, what is that? And they've had to like get letters from their school principal saying that, yes, this person speaks English. Well, I mean, it's those kinds of policies, and those are frontline workers who are sending letters out to people that really, we have no idea how many people were turned away because of something like that. So again, you know, we need to be very careful about what impedes and how policy can impede our work. And I know I don't have a lot of time here. I could talk all day, of course, but I do believe that this act is taking us, you know, it's an important thing. It's not perfect, you know, will need to be reworked, but I would like to see a little bit of deeper work around a language reclamation perspective and our, you know, recognition for what people do in community and with the kinds of knowledge systems. I'd like to give a shout out here to Blue Quills University too, and you know, I'm not the only person we're not the only people in Alberta doing things. They do some brilliant work there. And I know there's a representative at this around their adult Cree immersion BA, and the kinds of depths of work on the land and that, again, policies impede. I mean, because of the way things are set up, they don't always have access to the same kind of resources. And I just think this really needs to be thought about. What will Bill C-91 do and not do? You know, I certainly have questions about what it will do for our participants, our 120 students every summer, the communities that they go home to. You know, how will the provincial governments take up this work? And it is so exciting to hear what is happening in BC, because we certainly don't see that here in terms of provincial government, and how may the principles of this act be planned for? What kinds of planning will be taking place at a whole range of levels? And how will this kind of more macro policy align with what is going on in the more local? And how are our institutions of higher ed going to take up this policy as well? Don't have a lot of time, but I do want to take a few minutes to what I did in my paper was address how I felt we have addressed some of the goals of this act through our courses. And I know I'm down to a few minutes here. So, but in general, because we're not really a research institute in any formal way. We're a teaching center. And so the kinds of things that are in this act, we do in our courses. The support and promotion of Indigenous languages and reclamation of Indigenous languages. Our students will take courses. They take a course, for example, Introduction to Indigenous Language Education, where they get to look at what people are doing in other parts of the world. What are some of the key principles that they need to think about? We have a course on leadership in Indigenous languages education, and what can they as community members do? Linda Pelly would say, you lead from wherever you stand. And just because you're a language instructor in a school or a TA, that doesn't mean you can't have some leadership roles and speaking to your more formal leaders. And our students in that class, for example, do an activity around doing some language planning, whether it be for a MAP program or whether it be for a language nest or a home language policy. That's up to them. In our linguistics courses, they take a required course on digitizing their language, and they do very hands-on activities and assignments where they have things to take home. And that's one of our big goals, is that always there's a takeaway for our students from each of their courses, things that they can take home back to their community and use there. Things like, I see the funding issue is going to be ongoing and continuing to be difficult. I hate how it pitches people against each other, but, I do see that the act will hopefully, and the development that comes out of it will give some coordination in all of that. And the cooperation between agencies. We actually walk our students in one of our courses through that SWOT exercise that Dr. GALLA was talking about, and have them think about the governing bodies that they deal with in their community, their band council, their school board, and work through some of the kind of planning models for using that. So I'm just going to take a couple more minutes here. And our Young Women's Indigenous Circle of Leadership is something that we're very proud of. And we've been working on this for 10 years. And it's a dual language bilingual program with about 25 girls each summer. They come for 8 days, full days. And we do a couple of days out on the land. We have a full-time elder working with us. The girls also do things like creative theater and identity. Who am I as a young urban Cree woman? What does it mean to be Cree, being proud to be Cree? And we explore, oh, sorry, that's my own timer for myself. This is just a picture of one of our instructors, Dr. Darlene Auger, does lullabies in Cree with the girls, and she has what we mostly think of as what would be a baby swing, but she swings each of the girls and sings with them. They do a lot of creating home space, nurturing spirits, feeling like belonging, relationality, access to the elders and Indigenous knowledges, ceremony starting right off with day one. And we're always looking for partners, and this is, if you have any interest in this, please get a hold of us. This one, I couldn't get the sound to work on it or the image, but this is our girls at the end of the program last summer. And they did skits in Cree and songs in Cree. And it was very powerful because these girls walk in the door 8 days earlier and they don't know a word of Cree. So we can't diminish even what every small effort and step, what it can be. What needs to be done a lot, aligning of policies. I really think we need a national public awareness campaign. We need to use all media avenues. Yes, even Twitter, I put on here. I have my students in my leadership class because I find that there's a lot of information, a lot of action on Twitter around Indigenous languages. And it's, maybe a low level resource tool, but everyone has access to it. And my students sign up on a Twitter account and follow, like as I do. I only follow Indigenous languages work on Twitter. That's my platform for that. Language families, because we work across the country with students from across the country, I'm always reminded that, these languages come in families and we should be working more in families than in provinces. How do we do that? And my very last pitch, and then I really will stop, is our networking. And some of you may be familiar with FEL Canada, the Foundation for Endangered Languages of Canada, a relatively new, small national group that is looking to try and connect people together. And please go to the FEL website. And the last newsletter, we made a very conscious attempt of trying to represent what is going on in other parts of Canada. And it's a very informative, it's a 45-page newsletter. So it's more than just news. It's long, but there will be things in there that will be, our students love being members because, if you're at a place like Tuktoyaktuk or even in, Fort Providence, you don't always know what's going on in the rest of Canada. So they get a little glimpse twice a year from the newsletter. We need to continue to look at program development across the ages, all the kinds of things that people have been talking about in these past 2 days. And I would like to remind ourselves that, the kind of why we do what we do is a really important thing, and that kind of ideological clarification. There are many things we don't do at CILLDI that we wish we could. Our university is big and slow and not always nimble on its feet. And, I do look forward to a day when we have some policy development at our local institution. Just a few more pics of the Young Women in Action and posters of some of the kinds of things our CILLDI students said this summer at our 20th birthday party. Mm-hmm. There's FEL and the website at the bottom. Help us build networks, please. Get announcements out, support small initiatives, and support students. One of the new things we have with FEL is we have a student conference travel bursary, and this year we've given out 3. So for 3 students to go to a conference somewhere, an Indigenous Languages conference, some have gone to the conference in Saskatchewan, some went to the conference in BC this fall. We had 2 went to SLIT, the Stabilizing Indigenous Languages conference last spring in Winnipeg. So it's a nice little bonus if you have students who would like to go to a conference on Indigenous languages, they can apply. It's only a $500 bursary, but it could pay your airfare and your meals. So please share that with your students. I'm not going to go through those. That's really all I have to say. I'll take some questions. I've talked enough.
Thank you, Heather. We really appreciate your focus on both the past and the future of CILLDI. and positioning that in terms of the legislation, what that might mean. I'd like to shout out to FEL, thank you for that. And also the call for aligning policies across jurisdictions is really important. I think something that's come out time and again today. We have a few minutes for questions. A lot of folk coming up to the podium. Shout out, here they come.
I guess, well, Heather, hi. I just wanted to say, well, first of all, Heather for with CILLDI, that's many years ago with Donna passed me. That's, I don't know, that's 20 years, but I just want to say a big vote of thanks to Heather, because we started out of the Foundation for Endangered Languages of Canada at a conference we had in 2013 at Carleton University, and that was attended. Well, we had Laurie Williams, we had John Tompkins, we had people from across Canada, and it was amazing. And out of that, we founded a FEL Canada. And the last newsletter we had, I think this is newsletter 8. I lost track, but it is a phenomenal newsletter. It's 45 pages long. If you go through that newsletter, you'll know what's happening in Indigenous languages across Canada. It's just phenomenal. And I'm no longer on the board, but it's just been a lot of work that, I mean, a labor of love. And I would just like to say that Stephanie here is currently on the board and looking after the website. If you want to.
Just a huge shout out to Heather.
Yes,
Yes. Putting all of this together, and if you have things that you want to share on the FEL Facebook page or on the FEL website or anything like that, you can get in contact with any of us, and we can help spread the word. So, thank you. Big much.
There.
All right.
Hi, Heather.
Hi there.
You're right on the podium in front of me as well. It's Sherry.
Yes, Jerry.
And I really want to thank you for the shout out to University Nuhalatane Cross. The shout out's important because as Indigenous owned and governed post-secondary institutions, we're often not involved in a lot of these university conversations. There are 9 Indigenous post-secondary owned and governed institutions in Ontario where we are. How many are here?
Can you say that again? Sorry.
There are 9 Indigenous owned and governed post-secondary institutions in Ontario. And how many are here, right? So that's why that shout out from Heather is really important to us, because they're acknowledging in Alberta our 5 Indigenous owned and governed post-secondary institutions. But it also illuminates a little bit of a challenge that we're encountering as Blue Quills, because we've carried that name for several years now. But even among language people, and our own as well, we're still Blue Quills University or University of Blue Quills.
Right.
If we're serious about the language, we need to pick it up. I want to acknowledge that this scenario feels like a little bit of a double-edged sword. I want to acknowledge all of the fine work that so many universities have been doing for a very long time. I want to acknowledge that many of us, including myself, have benefited from the university education, that many of our relations study and work in these institutions. But to quote Bob Dylan, perhaps the times they are changing. So I'm here to talk from the perspective of an Indigenous institution, what receives between 5 and 25% of the per capita student funding that other institutions in our territories get from the resources that come from our lands and our waters. And so there's some serious inequities that create barriers for our own people in our own institutions for doing this kind of work. And so I'm not here to say to the other universities, stop doing what you're doing, but I am here to say, where are you making room for our people? Not just as individuals, right? We've had some conversations in the past couple of days about individualism and collectivism. But what about the nation-to-nation relationship and the protocols that are required there? We've had some conversations in Alberta about the importance of those institutions making space for and supporting and investing in our institutions and acknowledging the authority of our institutions as duly appointed by our governments, by our nations, especially with respect to Indigenous knowledge and language. So I feel very cautious about taking our Indigenous knowledges and languages into universities, of being absorbed into that system. Because when I think about being absorbed, I think about Duncan Campbell's time. And he was with Indian Affairs and said, we will not stop until every Indian has been absorbed into the body politic. So I get very uncomfortable about being absorbed into systems because universities are all about ownership of knowledge and ownership of information. So there's serious OCAP considerations here that we really need to talk about, I think. So when we want to talk about decolonizing, and I'm just going to jump right into the meat of it without, I wrote about 3 pages on this particular next comment that was going to gently lead you into this idea. But in the interest of time, one of the first things we have to do in decolonizing is eliminate the supremacist binary of thinking and begin to explore ways in which Euro-birthed universities have contributed to colonization and can be partners in decolonization. I believe reconciliation invites us to illuminate the insidious intellectual infrastructure of imperialism and individualism. I can probably only talk like that because I went to university. I also think reconciliation invites us to look at both sides of the ledger. Right? That was my first introduction to reconcile. You reconcile your bank book. So you look at both sides of the ledger, you determine where the error has occurred, and you correct that error. So when we look at both sides of this ledger, where do we see the error? Where do we put our efforts at correcting it? I don't believe that the error is on the Indigenous side of the ledger, but I believe that we can help correct those errors. Our languages are our sovereignty. They carry everything that we are. They allow us to communicate our cosmology, our worldviews, our axiologies, epistemologies, ontologies, methodologies, right? All the nice fancy university words. They allow us to communicate our sophisticated social, political, legal, economic traditions and systems, our relationships with all of creation, our lands, our waters, the four-leggeds, the winged ones, the crawlers, the swimmers, the ones who live in, on, and under the waters and the earth. I also think about indigenization because we've been hearing a lot of that for the last several years. I tried to explain it to myself, so what can that mean? What parallel do I know? I've heard about anglicization. Look it up, to make English in form and character. So when institutions say they're indigenizing, are they telling me that they are becoming indigenous in form and character? That's everything from governance to curriculum, to pedagogy and andragogy, to all of the ologies. It covers everything, and I don't think that that's the intention. So we need to be really careful about how this work unfolds. And I just want to share a comment that I saw on Facebook today. Credit to Andrea Landry. Adding Indigenous knowledge into any colonial system or context is not decolonizing or indigenizing. It's just adding Indigenous knowledge into any colonial system or context. So I think that we need to inquire in all of the work that we do, who's setting the terms and conditions, who's setting the framework, who's making the decisions, who's managing the money, and who's getting the credit, who's publishing the articles. I think these are important things for the Academy to think about very, very carefully. And those comments come mostly from the presentation by our guest, Mr. Daniel, last night. So there are ways that you can help, which is to press your governments to provide adequate funding while respecting our governance, to invest in our institutions, and don't help us do it your way. Support us to do it our way. Invest in our institutions, respect our ability to do this work. I had a few minutes to go.
Ask him to know.
Okay, thank you, everyone.
One more.
And thank you, Matt Sarah.
Dinige.
Hi. My name is Max Charlotte. I'm from the Oneida First Nation here in Ontario. I advocate for the deaf. I teach the deaf. I've developed, along with my wife, Marcia, Oneida Sign Language to match our spoken language because of the circle's not a circle if there's anyone left out of it. And over the years, that's what's happened in the deaf society. The dominant society plays such a huge role in their life as far as education goes and those things. And then the traditional aspect of their life is on the other side. So a lot of times they find themselves caught in the middle. And I was wondering, you explaining your program, you're showing the pictures of the girls, is there opportunities available for young deaf women to take advantage of that? Or has that ever been approached? Or has there been people that come forward to say, I want that, but my daughter's deaf or whatever? What kind of accommodations have been met? Or can you see going forward to alleviate those problems? Suzanne? Rose? Stunder.